They called it beautification. I called it bulldozers ripping through 60 years of my grandmother's rose garden like it was just overgrowth in their way. One day I was sipping coffee on the porch, the next I was watching million-dollar neighbors glare at me like I'd parked a junkyard in their gated utopia. According to them, my land was ruining their views, violating community harmony, and apparently disturbing the emotional well-being of their labradoodles. Funny, no one complained when Grandma was alive, but now that a single, not rich guy owns 5 acres in their perfect circle, suddenly I'm the villain. Drop a comment if you've ever had someone smile to your face while quietly working to erase you from the map. What they didn't realize is some roots go deeper than property lines, and some people don't back down just because a homeowners association prints things on glossy paper. I've always been a man who appreciates boundaries. It comes with the territory of being a GIS specialist. My job is all about mapping, analyzing geographic data, and understanding how land connects. Ironic that my own property boundaries would become the center of the most intense battle of my life. My name is Nathan Collins, 38 years old, and until last spring I lived a relatively peaceful existence, working remotely from my apartment in Portland, dreaming of one day building a home on my grandmother's land. When she passed away at 92, she left me her cherished 5-acre property that had been in our family for over 60 years. It wasn't just land to her, or to me. It was where I'd learned to fish in the small lake, where I'd helped her tend her prized rose garden, and where I'd decided I wanted to eventually settle down. I remember one summer, after a bad year at work, I spent a month helping Grandma tend the roses. Not for any reason other than that the air out here smelled better than the city, and her smile somehow made everything easier. She'd often say, "Land doesn't just belong to you, Nathan. If you take care of it long enough, it starts taking care of you." It sounded like sentimental country wisdom back then. Now, I realize it was a warning. The property sat about 20 minutes outside Portland, in what used to be farmland, but was rapidly transforming into upscale development. 3 sides of my grandmother's land were now bordered by Valley View Estates, a prestigious gated community of million-dollar homes. I'd just finished clearing some overgrowth around the old cabin when a sleek black Range Rover pulled up my gravel driveway. A woman in her early 40s stepped out, designer sunglasses perched on her head, her posture radiating confidence that only comes from someone used to getting what they want. "Mr. Collins? I'm Eleanor Winters, president of the Valley View Estates Homeowners Association. I was hoping we could have a chat about your property." Her smile was practiced, but her eyes were calculating, instantly assessing the value of everything they landed on. Inside the cabin, over coffee served in my grandmother's chipped mugs that looked comically rustic next to Eleanor's manicured appearance, she laid out what she called a generous opportunity. The HOA wanted to purchase my property to expand their community. "We're prepared to offer you $300,000, she said, sliding a folder across the table. "Well below market value," I replied, not even needing to open it. "This property has been in my family for generations. I'm planning to build here." Her smile tightened just a fraction. "I understand sentimentality, Nathan, but you have to admit your grandmother's place is quaint. Valley View has certain standards. Your property in its current state impacts our community aesthetics, which affects home values." She tapped the folder. "Think about it. $300,000 could buy you something much more practical." The conversation ended cordially enough, with her leaving her business card and an invitation to reach out when you've had time to consider the practical aspects of the situation. I didn't know then that this was just the opening move in what would become a calculated campaign. Within a week, I noticed the first signs. The friendly waves from dog-walking neighbors stopped. Construction vehicles accidentally blocked my driveway multiple times. County surveyors appeared, claiming they needed to verify boundary markers due to discrepancies in the records. When I checked with the county office, no such order existed. Then one morning, I found several of my property stakes had been moved overnight, about 8 feet into what was clearly my land according to every document I owned. I was retrieving my mail at the end of the driveway when I overheard Eleanor's voice from the coffee shop patio across the street. She was sitting with an elderly man I'd later learn was Howard Pierce, a former real estate attorney who served on the HOA board. "The access road solution works perfectly," she was saying, not noticing me nearby. "He can keep his precious land. He just won't be able to use it." Howard looked uncomfortable, but nodded. I ducked away before they saw me, my heart pounding. Whatever they were planning, I needed to prepare. Little did I know that within 48 hours, their plan would already be in motion, and I would find myself quite literally cut off from my own inheritance. I had spent the morning in virtual meetings and was heading back to check on the property when I saw them 3 massive construction vehicles parked along my access road, with workers actively digging up the only driveway connecting my land to the main road. I slammed on my brakes, jumping out of my car. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, approaching a man in a hard hat who appeared to be supervising. He barely glanced at me, checking something on his clipboard. "Road repair and boundary restoration. We have permits." He handed me a document that looked official enough, with county letterhead. "This is my private access road," I insisted. The supervisor shrugged. "Not according to the news survey. This section belongs to Valley View Estates. You can take it up with them if you have a problem." Behind him, a worker operating a backhoe was already tearing up 20 feet of what had been my driveway for decades. By the afternoon, I was sitting in the office of Sarah Rodriguez, a local attorney known for taking on development companies. She wasn't what I expected. Her office was modest, and her direct manner lacked the polish of corporate lawyers. But her reputation for tenacity preceded her. "They've been planning this," she said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "The HOA quietly filed for easement revisions last month, claiming historical boundaries were incorrect. They submitted a new survey that conveniently redraws your access point as their property." She looked up at me, her expression grim. "I've seen this before. They're trying to isolate your property to force you to sell." By the end of the day, Sarah had filed for an emergency injunction, and a judge had temporarily halted the construction pending review. Eleanor didn't waste time changing tactics. Within days, flyers circulated throughout Valley View Estates about an urgent community meeting regarding property values. I obtained a copy from Jason Kent, a 44-year-old resident who lived on the edge of the development nearest my property. Unlike his neighbors, he'd been friendly, occasionally stopping to chat when I was working outside. "They're organizing the community against you," he warned, looking nervously over his shoulder as we spoke at the local hardware store. "Eleanor is telling everyone your neglected eyesore is lowering their property values by 15%. She's encouraging people to file complaints with the county." True to his warning, county inspectors showed up 3 times that week, citing anonymous complaints about hazardous conditions and environmental concerns. The temporary construction halt gave me a brief reprieve, but Eleanor had already secured her next move. 3 weeks after the road incident, new construction began along the property line. A 6-foot decorative stone wall that Valley View claimed was for aesthetic enhancement of the community perimeter. The wall was strategically positioned to block the narrow maintenance path I'd been using since they'd destroyed my main access road. When I tried to object, the county permits office informed me the wall was being built entirely on Valley View property and they had every right to construct it. The wall was completed in just under 2 weeks, effectively enclosing my property on all sides except for a narrow strip of wetland that was impassable by vehicle. It was a rainy Tuesday when Eleanor's Range Rover appeared again, pulling up to where I was attempting to carry supplies through mud to reach my property. "This situation is becoming untenable for you, Nathan," she said, watching me struggle with a generator. The next morning, I found a large pile of construction debris dumped on the corner of my property. Broken concrete, twisted rebar, and splintered wood. I filed a complaint with the county, which was promptly dismissed by an inspector, who claimed it was sufficient to warrant action. As I cleaned up what I could, something metallic caught my eye beneath the rubble. A small, mud-covered metal box. Prying it open revealed a collection of my grandmother's documents protected in plastic sleeves, property deeds, correspondence with the county, and what appeared to be original survey maps. As I carefully examined each paper, one caught my attention, the original property deed with a section highlighted in faded yellow marker. The language was complex, but one phrase stood out clearly. Perpetual unobstructed access. My grandmother had left me more than just land. She'd left me ammunition for the fight ahead. "I think we both know it's only going to get more difficult." She didn't bother with the friendly pretense this time. "The HOA has authorized me to offer you $250,000 for the property. That's our final offer." When I stared at her in disbelief, she added with a thin smile, "Oh, and you might want to consider it quickly. I hear there have been some maintenance issues with the water and power lines in this area. Would be a shame if you experienced extended outages." She handed me a business card with the offer price written on the back. "I need your answer in 48 hours. I called Sarah immediately. "They're not just isolating the property, they're threatening utilities now," I explained. Her sigh was heavy through the phone. We expected this. Courts move slowly, Nathan. They're counting on wearing you down before we get a hearing. I found myself staring at my grandmother's photo that night, wondering if holding on to her land was worth this battle. My phone rang. It was Mabel Johnson, my grandmother's oldest friend. "Heard you're having trouble with those Valley View vultures," she said without preamble. I hadn't told her, but in small communities, news travels fast. "Your grandmother dealt with developers too, you know. They tried for decades to get her land." Her voice strengthened. "She always said, land is the only thing they aren't making any more of, Nathan. Once you sell it, it's gone forever. She'd never let those vultures win. Neither should you." The first light of dawn found me hunched over my grandmother's papers spread across my kitchen table, my eyes burning from hours of reading. The highlighted clause in the original deed stated clearly that when my grandmother sold portions of her original 20-acre farm in the 1960s, she retained perpetual and unobstructed access rights to the remaining parcel via the Eastern Access Road, and that these rights shall remain with the property regardless of future development or ownership changes of surrounding parcels. I immediately called Sarah, who answered despite the early hour. "This could change everything," she said after I explained my discovery. "We need to get to the county records office as soon as it opens. Bring everything you found." The county records office was an unremarkable government building staffed by individuals who rarely saw the kind of urgent energy Sarah and I brought through the doors that morning. "We need all historical records for the Collins property and surrounding parcels." But when the clerk returned, she looked uneasy. "That particular binder was checked out earlier today," she said without meeting our eyes. "By who?" Sarah asked. No answer, just silence and the faint whir of a security camera above us. Sarah informed the clerk, who blinked at us owlishly from behind ancient spectacles. What followed was hours of methodical research, Sarah examining legal documents while I used my GIS training to compare historical maps with current surveys. The picture that emerged was damning. Not only did I have deeded access rights, but the property also included water rights to the small stream that fed the lake, plus a 15-foot easement along the entire eastern boundary. Most importantly, we discovered that Eleanor's new survey had used boundary markers that had been deliberately placed to contradict the original property lines. "They knew," I said, connecting the dots. "They knew about these rights and deliberately tried to hide them by filing the new survey." Sarah nodded grimly. "This isn't their first rodeo, but now we have evidence for an emergency injunction." By that afternoon, she had filed new paperwork with the court, and we were granted an emergency hearing for the following week. When we emerged from the courthouse, I felt the first glimmer of hope I'd experienced in weeks. The sense of being powerless was lifting, replaced by a growing determination, fueled by the knowledge that my grandmother had foreseen these challenges decades ago and had protected her land, and by extension me, through careful legal foresight. That evening, Jason Kent appeared at my temporary rental apartment, looking nervous. "I need to tell you something," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. "I overheard Eleanor talking at an HOA meeting last night. She used to work for Westlake Development, the same company that tried to buy your grandmother's land 15 years ago. This isn't just business for her, it's personal. Apparently your grandmother's refusal to sell cost Eleanor a major promotion back then." This new information cast everything in a different light. This wasn't just about expanding Valley View Estates, it was about Eleanor settling an old score. The realization made me angry, but it also gave me valuable insight into my opponent's motivations. The deposition for our emergency hearing took place in a sterile conference room at Sarah's office. Howard Pierce, Eleanor's legal ally from the HOA board, looked uncomfortable as Sarah questioned him about the road access destruction. The board was informed that the road work was necessary to correct historical boundary errors, he stated nervously. "And who provided that information to the board?" Sarah pressed. Howard adjusted his collar. Eleanor presented the findings from the new survey. Sarah slid a document across the table. "Mr. Pierce, is this the board meeting minutes from March 10th? Howard nodded. "Please read the highlighted section." His face paled as he read aloud. "EWW confirms Phase 2 of property isolation strategy to begin next week. Access points A and B to be addressed first." He looked up, visibly shaken. I wasn't at this particular meeting, but the damage was done. We had written evidence of a deliberate strategy to cut off my access. I spent evenings studying my grandmother's journals, which contained detailed accounts of her interactions with developers over the years. I discovered she'd been remarkably strategic. consulting with lawyers and surveyors to protect her land long before Valley View was even conceived. Her notes showed she'd anticipated exactly the kind of tactics Eleanor was now employing, which explained the careful legal language in the deed. I found myself developing a deeper appreciation for her foresight, along with a growing confidence in my ability to defend what she had protected for so long. I was no longer just reacting to Eleanor's attacks. I was beginning to formulate a strategy of my own, drawing on my grandmother's wisdom and my own professional skills as a geographical information specialist. The day before our hearing, I received a text from Jason. Emergency HOA meeting called tonight. Eleanor freaking out about something. Hours later, I spotted Eleanor in heated conversation with Howard outside the Valley View clubhouse. Even from a distance, her body language conveyed agitation, arms gesturing sharply, face flushed. As I drove past, I caught a fragment of her words carried on the evening breeze. He found the clause. We need to move to Plan B immediately before he realizes what else is in there. What else was in the deed that had her so worried? I spent the night reviewing every document again, searching for what I might have missed. But it wasn't until the preliminary hearing the next day that I began to understand the true scope of what my grandmother had built into her legal protection. The judge, an older woman with shrewd eyes, listened carefully to both sides before making her ruling. I'm postponing a final decision pending further review, she announced. However, there are troubling questions about the HOA's actions that warrant deeper examination. The temporary injunction against further access restrictions will remain in place until the full hearing. It wasn't a complete victory, but Eleanor's expression, a mixture of shock and barely contained fury, told me we'd landed a significant blow. As we left the courthouse, Sarah squeezed my arm. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Now we need to prepare for their counterattack, because trust me, it's coming." She was right. What I didn't realize was how vicious that counterattack would be, or how close I would come to losing everything before finding my grandmother's final, most powerful legal safeguard. The flyer appeared on every doorstep in Valley View Estates and surrounding neighborhoods overnight. Glossy paper featuring my photograph, clearly taken without my knowledge, alongside alarming text, "Safety alert, dangerous individual, threatening community values." The content painted me as an unstable loner with a vendetta against the community, citing numerous confrontations and threatening behavior that had raised concerns among residents and law enforcement. At the bottom was my personal information, including my phone number and the address of my temporary rental. By noon, I had received dozens of threatening calls and found my car vandalized with the words "Get out" scratched into the paint. When I called the police, the responding officer seemed oddly unsympathetic. "Sounds like you've upset a lot of people," he remarked, barely taking notes. "Maybe you should consider moving on before this escalates." The next blow came that afternoon, an email from my employer expressing serious concerns about reports received regarding threatening behavior in your community. Despite my attempts to explain the situation, by the end of the day I had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. With my income suddenly suspended and legal bills mounting, the financial pressure became another weapon in Eleanor's arsenal. Sarah tried to reassure me. "This is classic intimidation. They're trying to destroy your support system to force you to give up." But her usual confidence seemed diminished when she called the next day. "The judge assigned to our case has recused herself, citing a conflict of interest," she explained. "We've been reassigned to Judge William Foster." The name clearly troubled her. Foster has known connections to development companies. He's ruled against individual property owners in similar cases 8 times in the past 3 years. The morning of our rescheduled hearing, I woke to pounding on my door. 2 police officers stood outside with a warrant. "Nathan Collins, you're being charged with criminal trespassing and vandalism on Valley View Estates property," the officer announced. They showed me security camera footage of someone who resembled me from a distance, cutting through a section of Valley View's decorative fencing. The timestamp showed 3 a.m. the previous night, when I had been asleep in my apartment. "This is obviously doctored," I protested. The officers remained impassive. "Tell it to the judge. You can come voluntarily or in handcuffs." I spent 6 hours in a holding cell before Sarah arranged bail, returning to find my apartment had been searched in my absence. By the time we appeared before Judge Foster, the situation seemed hopeless. He reviewed our evidence with visible skepticism while accepting the HOA's arguments with minimal questioning. When I returned to my rental that evening, I found the electricity and water shut off, with notices citing maintenance issues that would require several weeks to resolve. With criminal charges pending, my employment in jeopardy, mounting legal fees, and now uninhabitable housing, I felt the walls closing in. That night, sitting in my darkened apartment using my phone's flashlight to see, I called Sarah. "I don't know if I can keep fighting," I admitted, my voice hollower than I wanted it to sound. "They're systematically destroying my life. Maybe I should just take whatever offer is still on the table and walk away." Sarah was silent for a long moment. "Nathan, I think we need to change tactics," she finally said. "They're expecting us to keep fighting the same way. What if we appear to give up?" I didn't understand at first, but as she explained her thinking, a strategy began to form. "Eleanor has overplayed her hand," Sarah continued. "The criminal charges, the utility shutoffs, the obvious interference with your employment, it's all so blatant that it creates a pattern we can use. But first, we need her to believe she's won." The plan was risky. I would withdraw my lawsuit and signal willingness to negotiate, making Eleanor believe her pressure campaign had succeeded. During this false surrender, we would gather evidence of her methods that could be used for a much stronger counterattack. The next morning, I drafted a letter to the HOA board indicating my intention to withdraw my legal challenge and discuss sale terms. Within hours, I received a call from Eleanor herself, her voice dripping with poorly concealed triumph. "I'm glad you've come to your senses, Nathan. I'll have paperwork drawn up for a final offer of $200,000. The price had dropped again. Another power play. "I just want this to be over," I replied, injecting defeat into my voice. "I'll need a few days to clear out my grandmother's belongings." She agreed magnanimously, already savoring her victory. "Take until the weekend, we'll sign the papers Monday morning." What she didn't know was that Jason had agreed to let me stay in his guest house while continuing to publicly maintain distance from me. From this safe location, we would implement the next phase of our plan. True to form, Eleanor organized a victory celebration at the Valley View Clubhouse, inviting key officials and board members to discuss future development plans now that the obstacle is removed. What she didn't know was that Jason had planted recording devices in the clubhouse the day before. As I sat in his guest house listening to the live audio feed, I heard Eleanor, flush with success, reveal everything. "The new commercial development will triple our initial investment," she boasted to the attendees. "Once we level that eyesore of a property and drain the small lake, we'll have prime real estate for the shopping complex." A man's voice, Howard's, asked cautiously, "What about the environmental impact concerns for the wetlands?" Eleanor's laugh was dismissive. "Those reports have been handled. Our friends at the county have ensured smooth sailing. By the time the evening ended, we had recorded multiple admissions of falsified evidence, bribed officials, and deliberate property rights violations, enough to bring to a different judge and prosecutor. And as we played the tape back, her voice hit harder than any punch. Once we leveled that lake, prime real estate for the shopping complex. The recording from Eleanor's victory celebration proved to be exactly the evidence we needed. Sarah took it directly to the district attorney, bypassing the local police entirely. Within 48 hours, the criminal charges against me had been dropped, and the DA had opened an investigation into Eleanor's activities. "The recording demonstrates clear intent to falsify evidence," Sarah explained as we sat in her office reviewing next steps. "But more importantly, it gives us leverage for a counter lawsuit that will make your previous filing look like a parking ticket. We crafted a comprehensive legal counterattack, documenting every instance of harassment, false claims, and property rights violations. The new lawsuit named not just the HOA, but Eleanor personally, along with several county officials who had facilitated her schemes. Meanwhile, local journalist Carmen Washington had caught wind of the situation. A fierce 35-year-old investigative reporter for the regional news outlet, she approached me through Sarah. "I've been tracking development disputes in the county for years," she explained during our first meeting. "Your case fits a pattern, but this time there's hard evidence." Her resulting exposé, Property Rights Nightmare, Developers Vendetta Exposed, detailed Eleanor's history of similar tactics against other holdout property owners. The story gained traction beyond local media, catching the attention of a state senator known for advocating for property rights legislation. When Carmen's article included snippets of the recording where Eleanor bragged about manipulating county officials, the public reaction was immediate and damning. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that descended into chaos when several members demanded to know why they were now facing legal liability for Eleanor's actions. The recording revealed she had consistently misled the board about legal costs and risks, presenting my property as an easy acquisition rather than the legal quagmire it had become. "You told us this was a routine boundary adjustment," one member was overheard shouting. "Now we're all being sued." The unified front Eleanor had cultivated began fracturing under pressure, with members publicly distancing themselves from her decisions. Jason, my inside source, reported that 3 board members had consulted independent attorneys about their personal liability, fearing the consequences of their involvement in what was clearly becoming a scandal. The most surprising development came on a rainy evening when I answered a knock at Jason's guesthouse door to find Howard Pierce standing there, shoulders hunched against the downpour. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice weary, not as Eleanor's attorney, but as someone who can't be part of this anymore. Over the next 2 hours, Howard revealed how Eleanor had initially brought him into her schemes by threatening to expose his past ethical violations that could have cost him his law license. "She's been doing this for years," he explained. "But this time, she's gone too far. I'll testify about everything, the fake surveys, the deliberate targeting of your access points, all of it." His testimony would prove invaluable, but even more important was the file he brought with him, complete documentation of Eleanor's history of similar tactics at 3 previous developments. With Howard's help, Sarah and I dove deeper into my grandmother's deed, discovering what had truly frightened Eleanor when she realized I'd found the access clause. Hidden within the legal language was something far more powerful, a community access reversion provision that stated if access to the Collins property was ever deliberately blocked by adjacent development, control of certain common areas would automatically revert to the Collins property owner. These areas specifically included the main entrance road to Valley View Estates and the Central Park area, essential components of the development that gave it its premium status. My grandmother, it seemed, had anticipated this exact scenario decades ago and built in a nuclear option that would give her descendants extraordinary leverage if developers ever tried to box them in. Sarah worked meticulously to document every access violation, building an irrefutable case that would trigger the reversion clause. I used my GIS skills to create detailed maps showing the original property boundaries, access points, and the systematic way they had been blocked by Valley View construction. We compiled time-stamped photographs, county records, and witness statements into a comprehensive evidence package that even a developer-friendly judge would find difficult to dismiss. As we prepared our case, I received an anonymous envelope containing HOA financial records, showing Eleanor had diverted development fees to personal accounts. The attached note read simply, "Not everyone on the board agrees with what's happening. Ready for the real trap? Trigger the reversion clause." The preparation for our counterattack was nearly complete when Eleanor made her next move. Perhaps sensing the changing tide, she suddenly shifted tactics, reaching out through an intermediary to offer an olive branch. "Eleanor is prepared to restore your access road as a goodwill gesture," the message stated. "She hopes we can resolve this matter amicably without further legal action." It was a transparent attempt to prevent us from filing the reversion claim. Sarah and I discussed the approach carefully. "She's scared," Sarah observed. "She's finally realized what the reversion clause means for Valley View. This is an opportunity." We agreed that I would meet with Eleanor, wearing a concealed recorder, to see what additional evidence we might gather before springing our trap. The meeting took place at a neutral location, a conference room at the local library. Eleanor arrived with 2 board members, but without Howard, whose absence was conspicuous. Her demeanor had changed dramatically. Gone was the imperious developer, replaced by someone projecting reasonable compromise. "We've clearly gotten off on the wrong foot," she began, her smile strained. "The board has reconsidered our position and wants to restore full access to your property immediately." But as the conversation continued and Eleanor grew more comfortable believing she was regaining control, the facade began to slip. When one board member left to take a call, she leaned forward. "Once this is smoothed over and you sell, which you eventually will, we'll proceed with the commercial zone as planned. That lake of yours is the perfect drainage site for the parking lots." The remaining board member nodded, adding, "The environmental variances are already arranged." They had no idea their words were being memorialized, providing the final evidence we needed. The morning after my meeting with Eleanor, Carmen Washington published her most damning article yet. Titled, "Caught on Tape, Developer Admits to Environmental Manipulation in Valley View Dispute." It included selected quotes from the recorded conversation that exposed Eleanor's continuing deception. By noon, environmental groups had announced plans to investigate potential wetlands violations, and the county commissioner's office released a statement distancing itself from any improper permitting practices. The public reaction was swift and merciless. Valley View residents, now concerned about both their property values and their association's reputation, flooded the HOA with demands for Eleanor's removal. The pressure from multiple directions created exactly the chaotic environment we needed for our next move. Sarah filed our motion to activate the reversion clause the following morning, submitting it to a newly assigned judge with a reputation for strict interpretation of property law. Our filing included comprehensive documentation of each access violation, supported by Howard's sworn affidavit and the damning recordings. The court scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week, but the immediate effect was to freeze any development activities on the disputed areas. When Eleanor attempted to have construction crews remove several trees along my property line, presumably to eliminate evidence of the original boundary markers, the sheriff's department intervened, warning that any further alterations to the disputed property would result in criminal charges. The emergency hearing was held in a packed courtroom. Valley View residents filled the gallery, many openly hostile toward Eleanor rather than me, a remarkable shift from just weeks earlier. Judge Martina Reynolds, a severe woman with a reputation for meticulous attention to detail, reviewed our evidence methodically. When Eleanor's new attorney attempted to dismiss the reversion clause as antiquated and unenforceable, Judge Reynolds cut him off. This clause was properly registered with the county and has remained unchallenged for 43 years, she stated firmly. Its language is unambiguous. After just 2 hours of arguments, she delivered her ruling. The court finds clear and convincing evidence of deliberate and systematic blocking of legal access to the Collins property. According to the terms of the 1967 deed, control of the specified common areas shall revert to Mr. Collins effective immediately. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Valley View residents looked stunned as they realized what this meant. Their Grand Entrance Boulevard and the Central Park area that gave the development its premium status now legally belonged to me. Eleanor's face drained of color as the judge continued. Furthermore, the evidence suggests possible criminal violations regarding falsified surveys and permits. I am referring those matters to the district attorney's office for investigation. As we left the courthouse, reporters surrounded us, but Sarah expertly fielded questions while I maintained a dignified silence. The headlines the next day ranged from David defeats Goliath in epic property rights battle to Valley View residents in shock as HOA loses control of prime areas. The panic among Valley View residents was immediate and intense. Property values plummeted overnight as real estate listings specified uncertain access rights to homes. The HOA called an emergency community meeting that descended into near chaos as homeowners demanded answers. "What happens to our homes now?" one shouted. "Can he block our access completely?" asked another. Eleanor attempted to maintain control of the meeting but was shouted down repeatedly. When she finally suggested that temporary inconvenience might be necessary while they fought the ruling, Jason stood up. "This is entirely your doing, Eleanor," he declared, his previous fear gone. "You pursued a personal vendetta against Nathan Collins, and now we're all paying the price." It was the first time a resident had publicly challenged her, and it broke the dam. Others began sharing stories of Eleanor's heavy-handed tactics and questionable financial decisions. Eleanor wasn't finished, however. That night, security cameras Jason had installed captured footage of her directing a small team attempting to bulldoze a section of the disputed entrance road, presumably hoping to create irreversible damage before I could take control. The sheriff's department responded to Jason's call and arrested Eleanor at the scene for criminal damage to property and violation of a court order. The footage showed her screaming at deputies that she would bury this whole development before letting that Collins boy win. The shocking scene was picked up by local news stations, cementing public opinion against her and leading the remaining HOA board members to formally remove her as president in an emergency session. Howard Pierce provided crucial testimony about Eleanor's instruction to make the problem go away by any means necessary. The criminal investigation expanded rapidly, with county officials now eager to cooperate to avoid implications in the growing scandal. Records revealed Eleanor had indeed bribed local inspectors and falsified environmental impact statements. Most damning was the discovery that she had personally orchestrated the falsification of survey markers, hiring a team to move them under cover of darkness to create the impression my property boundaries were different than legally recorded. As these details emerged, the new acting HOA president, ironically Jason Kent, approached me with a settlement offer. "The residents aren't your enemies," he explained. "Most of us had no idea what Eleanor was doing. We're just families who want to protect our homes." The offer included significant financial compensation for the harassment I'd endured, permanent easement guarantees for my property, and a commitment to restore all damaged areas to their original condition. As I considered their offer, I made a final, thorough review of Eleanor's development plans, which had been seized during the investigation. What I found was shocking, even after everything that had happened. Her commercial development wouldn't just affect my property, it would drastically alter the local watershed. The plans called for draining the wetlands that fed the small lake on my property, which would not only destroy a sensitive ecosystem, but potentially cause flooding issues for dozens of homes in the area during heavy rains. This revelation expanded the implications beyond my personal property rights dispute to an environmental issue affecting the entire community. It was time to make a final decision about how to use the extraordinary leverage I now possessed. One that would determine not just my future, but that of Valley View Estates and the surrounding natural environment. The morning sun filtered through the mist rising off the small lake as I stood on my grandmother's property, trying to imagine what she would do in my position. I now held legal control over critical portions of Valley View Estates, and with it, the power to either punish the community that had supported Eleanor's campaign against me, or to forge a different path forward. After much reflection, I called a meeting with the new HOA board, local environmental experts, and Carmen Washington, whose reporting had been instrumental in exposing the truth. "I have no interest in holding your homes hostage," I told the assembled group, "but I do have 3 non-negotiable conditions for returning control of the common areas to Valley View. My first condition was the establishment of a permanent conservation easement protecting not just my land, but the entire wetland system that connected our properties. This would prevent any future development from draining the natural watershed or destroying the ecosystem my grandmother had protected for decades. The second condition was architectural and access rights for my planned home, ensuring no future HOA could attempt to isolate my property again. The third condition was the creation of a neighborhood oversight committee with binding authority over any major development decisions. A democratic check against the kind of unilateral power Eleanor had wielded. After some negotiation over details, the board unanimously accepted all conditions, clearly relieved that I wasn't seeking more punitive measures. The wetlands were preserved, the lake protected. Instead of building walls, we planted trees, and slowly, the land once seen as a burden became the soul of the neighborhood. Eleanor's legal troubles mounted as investigations revealed similar tactics at previous developments. She eventually faced multiple lawsuits and criminal charges for fraud, bribery of public officials, and environmental violations. The court ordered her to pay substantial restitution to affected property owners, including myself, though the financial penalties paled in comparison to the damage to her reputation and career. She eventually relocated to another state, her ambitions of becoming a major regional developer thoroughly destroyed. Howard Pierce, in exchange for his testimony, received immunity for his lesser role in the schemes. He dedicated his retirement years to establishing a legal aid foundation specifically focused on protecting individual property owners against predatory development tactics. With the dispute resolved and compensation from both the settlement and restitution, I finally began building my home on my grandmother's land. I designed a modest cottage that harmonized with the natural surroundings rather than dominating them. The most important feature was the new rose garden I planted using cuttings I'd carefully preserved from my grandmother's original plants. As the roses took root and flourished, I often thought about how she had meticulously planted legal safeguards with the same careful foresight, protecting not just the land but her family's future connection to it. The deed clause that had saved my inheritance became something of a local legend, studied by law students as a masterclass in property rights protection. Perhaps the most surprising outcome was the relationship that developed between Valley View Estates and my property. What began as an adversarial boundary eventually became a point of community pride and connection. The conservation area attracted bird watchers and nature enthusiasts, Local schools brought students for environmental education programs around the lake. Longtime residents who had initially viewed my property as an eyesore came to appreciate its role in preserving the natural character that made the area special in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The property Eleanor had tried to eliminate as incompatible with her vision for Valley View had become central to its identity and appeal. The county eventually adopted new regulations, informally known as the Collins Property Rights Act, strengthening protections against the tactics Eleanor had employed. The legislation required greater transparency in development plans, stricter verification of property boundaries, and enhanced notification requirements for affected landowners. Carmen's continued reporting on development issues helped build public awareness and support for these reforms. Sarah Rodriguez became something of a celebrity attorney in property rights circles, specializing in helping individual landowners stand up to powerful development interests. She often cited my case as a turning point in her career and in local property rights enforcement. 1 year after the court decision, on a perfect summer evening, I hosted a neighborhood picnic on my property. Children played along the lakeshore where I had once fished with my grandmother. Valley View residents mingled with environmental activists who had supported the conservation efforts. Jason, now established as HOA president, presented me with a commemorative plaque recognizing the courage and vision that transformed conflict into community. As the sun set over the lake my grandmother had fought to protect, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us all to this moment. The land had been worth fighting for, not just because it was my inheritance, but because it represented something increasingly precious, a connection to our natural environment and to the wisdom of those who came before us. In my office overlooking the lake, I keep 2 framed items side by side on the wall. One is the deed clause that reversed control and ultimately forced Valley View to recognize my property rights. The other is a photograph of my grandmother standing proudly in her rose garden, her expression both gentle and determined. Together, they remind me daily that sometimes the most important boundaries aren't the ones drawn on maps, but the ones we establish through courage, foresight, and a willingness to stand our ground. And as her roses continue to bloom each spring around my new home, I know she would approve of how her final lesson in standing up to bullies has taken root and flourished, just like the land she loved.
That's a wrap from QA Stories, but don't go far. There's plenty more drama, twists, and unbelievable stories waiting for you on our channel.